I paid off my daughter's wedding venue, her dress, the flowers, all of it, and I've never once regretted it, not even after everything that happened at the reception. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it really began. On the phone, the night she called to tell me she was engaged. I was sitting in my recliner with the football game muted, half asleep, when my phone lit up with her name. Emily. My daughter has called me 100,000 times in her life, but I could tell from the first dad that this call was different. There was a pitch in her voice I hadn't heard since she was 17 and got into her first choice college. "Dad," she said, and then she couldn't even get the rest out for a second. She just laughed, this bright, nervous laugh. "Dad," he asked me. David asked me to marry him. I hadn't even met David more than a handful of times, but I knew what he meant to her, and that was enough for me. I stood up out of that recliner so fast I nearly knocked over my coffee. I told her I was happy for her, so happy, and I meant every word of it. My wife, Carol, had passed 4 years before that, breast cancer, the kind that takes its time and takes everything with it. And in the years since, it had just been me and Emily, checking in on each other, having dinner on Sundays, learning how to be a family of 2 instead of a family of 3. Hearing her that happy on the phone, hearing that future in her voice, it did something to me. It felt like a door opening after a long time of the house being too quiet. I'd worked 31 years for the county, running heavy equipment, keeping roads and bridges from falling apart, and I'd put away what I could when I could. It was never going to make me rich, but I had a number in my head, a retirement number, the number that was supposed to let me stop working and just breathe for the first time in 3 decades. When Emily told me the wedding she wanted, small at first, just family, and then bigger again once Carol's sister and David's whole side of the family got involved, I watched that number in my head get smaller and smaller, and I didn't say a word. I just kept writing checks. The venue alone was more than I made in a year when I started at the county. A restored barn out past the vineyards, string lights, the whole picture-perfect thing you see in magazines. Then the dress, which Emily tried to talk herself out of, standing in the shop practically apologizing to me for how much it cost. And I told her, "Baby, your mother should be here to see you in a dress like that, and since she isn't, I am going to make sure you have it." I paid the caterer. I paid the florist. I paid the band. And I paid for a videographer so that someday, when I wasn't around anymore, Emily would have something to watch and remember her old man walking her down the aisle. I didn't do it because anyone forced me to. I did it because for 4 years I had been living in a house with an empty chair at the table, and giving my daughter the wedding of her dreams felt like the last real thing I could do for the family Carol and I had built. I saw it as my last big gift to both of them, to Emily and to the memory of her mother. I wasn't thinking about a return on investment. I was thinking about walking her down that aisle and knowing I had done right by her. David's parents, Richard and Diane, were a different kind of people than us. Richard had some kind of position at an investment firm downtown, and Diane hadn't worked in years, spent her time on committees and charity boards and, from what I could tell, spent a great deal of energy making sure everyone around her knew where she stood in the world. The first time I met them, at a dinner Emily arranged so the families could get acquainted, Diane looked at my hands, at the calluses that 31 years of machine work leaves on a man, and I watched her decide something about me in that half-second. She was polite. She was always polite, but it was the kind of polite you give the man who parks your car. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself Emily was marrying David, not marrying his parents, and that our job, mine and Richard's and Diane's, was just to stand back and let these 2 kids build their life. I paid for the wedding because it was my daughter, not because I needed Richard and Diane to like me. I want to be honest about that, because looking back, some of what happened afterward, I think I let happen because I was still, somewhere in the back of my mind, hoping they'd come around. The wedding planning went on for the better part of a year, and somewhere in there, I started to notice things. Small things, at first. Diane would call the venue directly instead of going through Emily, and changes would just appear, upgraded chairs, a different florist, a specific champagne, and, when I asked Emily about it, she'd get this tired look and say, "Dad, it's easier to just let her have her way on the little stuff. She's paying for the rehearsal dinner. Let her feel involved." And I understood that. I didn't want to be the difficult father who made his daughter's life harder in the run-up to her wedding. So I paid, and I stayed quiet, and I let Diane feel involved. David, for his part, was a good enough kid on the surface, worked in finance like his father, always shook my hand firm and looked me in the eye when I saw him, but he had this way of going soft and quiet whenever his mother was in the room. He'd defer to her on everything, the way some men do with their mothers even after they're grown, even after they're about to have a wife of their own. Emily used to laugh about it, before the wedding, called him a mama's boy with affection, the way you do when it's still just a quirk and not yet a warning sign. The wedding itself was beautiful. I'll give them that. I walked my daughter down that aisle in the golden hour, the light coming through the barn doors just right, and when I lifted her veil and kissed her cheek and handed her off to David, I felt something in my chest that I don't have the words for, pride and grief and love all knotted up together, because I was doing this alone, without Carol, and Emily could see it on my face, and she squeezed my hand before she let it go. That memory, that exact moment, is the one I've held onto through everything that came after. After the wedding, life did what life does. Emily and David bought a townhouse about 40 minutes from me, out past the interstate. In one of those developments with the identical mailboxes and the homeowners association that fines you for the wrong color of curtains, I helped them with the down payment too, a little, not as much as the wedding, but enough. I never made a thing of it. I told her, that's what fathers do, and left it there. For the first year, things were fine, better than fine. Emily called every week, sometimes twice a week, and we'd talk about nothing, about her job at the marketing firm, about the neighbor's dog, about whether I was eating enough vegetables, which was her way of checking on me since Carol wasn't there to do it anymore. David and I went to a Cardinals game together that first summer, just the two of us, and he loosened up without his mother around, told me about wanting to start his own consulting practice someday, and I thought, okay, this is going to be all right. This is going to work out. Then, slowly, the way water finds a crack in concrete, things started to shift. The calls from Emily got shorter. Sundays came and went without a dinner invitation, and when I'd bring it up, she'd say things were busy, work things, David's family things. Always some reason that sounded true enough on its own, but that started to add up to something when you stacked them all together. I started hearing Diane's name in almost every conversation. That's what Diane thought we should redo the kitchen. Diane found them a better financial advisor. Diane didn't think Emily's coworkers were the right crowd for her to be spending time with. I felt myself being edged out, not violently, not all at once, just steadily, the way a tide comes in without you noticing until you look down and your feet are already wet. I want to be fair here, because I've turned this over in my head 1,000 times since. I don't think Emily set out to push me aside. I think she was young and newly married, and trying to keep peace between a husband who wouldn't stand up to his mother and a mother-in-law who had decided, for whatever reason, that there wasn't room in that family for a retired road crew foreman with dirt-calloused hands and a modest little house on the wrong side of the county. I think Emily just kept absorbing the friction so nobody else had to feel it, and I was the one who ended up furthest from the center because I was the one who'd complain the least. 2 years into the marriage, David's consulting business, the one he talked about so excitedly at that Cardinals game, was ready to launch for real, and it needed capital. Not an enormous amount, but more than a young couple with a mortgage could put together on their own. Richard, for all his money, told David he didn't believe in just handing his son a business, said something about David needing to earn it the way he had, which I found rich coming from a man whose own father had started the firm he inherited. So David came to me. He drove out to my place on a Tuesday evening, alone, no Emily, which should have told me something right there. He sat at my kitchen table, the same table Carol and I had eaten 1,000 dinners at, and he asked if I'd consider being a cosigner on a business loan, and maybe, if I was willing, putting in some capital directly in exchange for a small ownership stake. He was nervous asking me, kept turning his coffee mug in little circles, and I remember thinking, this is a man who has never once in his life had to ask his own father for anything and be told no, and here he is asking me, and I felt for him. I told him I'd think about it, and I did think about it, hard, for 2 weeks. I talked to a lawyer friend from my county days about what it would mean to co-sign a loan and hold an equity stake in a private company. I want people listening to this to understand, I wasn't a fool about it. I think I made sure my name went on that paperwork not just as a guarantor, but as an actual minority owner in the company, 7%, on paper, real and legal, because something in my gut told me to protect myself even while I was trying to help. I signed the papers at a lawyer's office, not a kitchen table, with everything spelled out. David hugged me afterward, right there in the parking lot, and told me I'd changed his life. He meant it. I could see that he meant it. The business did well, better than any of us expected. Within a year, David had 3 employees and was renting office space downtown instead of working out of the spare bedroom. Emily started talking about it in our calls with real pride. My husband's company this, my husband's company that, and some small, quiet part of me thought, there it is, this is what I wanted. I wanted to matter to this family, and now I do. I should have known better than to let myself believe that so easily. The call about the anniversary party came from Emily on a Thursday afternoon in October. 3 years married, and Richard and Diane wanted to throw them a big anniversary celebration at their house, a real event, caterers, a tent in the backyard, the works, to celebrate the business hitting its first major milestone and the marriage hitting 3 years at the same time. Emily sounded happy telling me about it, and then she said, "And Dad, of course you're invited, we want you there," and something about the way she said of course made my stomach tighten just slightly. The way you feel a change in weather before the sky actually changes. I spent the week before that party the way I imagine a lot of fathers do before something that matters to them. I got a haircut. I didn't need that. I bought a new sport coat, navy blue, because Emily had once told me blue brought out my eyes. Back when she was a teenager and still said things like that to me, I polished my good shoes. I picked out a gift, and I didn't want to just bring another card with money in it, so I had something made. A wooden plaque with the date of David and Emily's wedding carved into it alongside a line from the poem Carol and I had read at our own wedding 30 years before. I thought it would mean something to Emily, a piece of her mother passed down into her marriage. I drove the 50 minutes out to Richard and Diane's house on a Saturday afternoon in early November, and I remember the drive clearly because I kept rehearsing in my head what I'd say to people, how I'd hold myself, because I always felt a little like I was walking onto a stage when I went to that house, a stage built for people who wore better shoes than mine. The house itself was the kind of place you see on television, brick and columns, and a circular driveway already packed with cars by the time I got there. I could hear music drifting from the backyard, and laughter, real laughter, the sound of a party already well underway even though I'd arrived at the time Emily had told me. I parked on the street, gathered up the wrapped plaque, and walked up toward the front door, and that's when Diane came out to meet me on the front steps, moving fast, like she'd been watching for my car. "Peter," she said, and I want to be clear, my name is not Peter, my name is Walter, and she had called me Peter more than once before, and I'd let it go each time because I told myself it wasn't worth the friction, but hearing it again, at the base of those front steps, on a day I'd spent a whole week preparing for, it landed different this time. "Walter," she corrected herself when I didn't answer right away, "we're actually doing the family photos in about 10 minutes out back and it's a bit tight with the photographer's timing, so would you mind coming around through the side gate instead of through the house? We've got caterers running through the front hall right now and I just don't want anyone underfoot." I told her that was fine. I want you to understand, the woman listening to this or the man listening to this, whoever you are, wherever you're driving right now while you hear my voice, you may already know where this is going, because maybe it's happened to you too. And if it has, I am sorry, truly, because I know exactly what it does to a person. I said it was fine, and I walked around the side of that beautiful brick house, past the manicured hedges, carrying a wooden plaque with my late wife's wedding poem carved into it, around to the backyard like a caterer myself instead of a father of the bride. The backyard was even more impressive than the front, a white tent, round tables already set with white linens, a jazz trio setting up in the corner, and 40 or 50 people already mingling with drinks in their hands, people I mostly didn't recognize, Richard's business associates, Diane's charity friends, the kind of crowd that made my navy sport coat feel suddenly cheap on my shoulders. I saw Emily across the lawn, beautiful, glowing, laughing at something someone said, and for just a second, seeing her like that, all of it felt worth it. The wedding, the business loan, the 50-minute drive, all of it. David spotted me and came over, and I want to give him this much credit. There was a flash of something like guilt on his face when he saw me standing there at the edge of the tent, a little lost, holding my gift. "Walter," he said, "hey, glad you made it," and he clapped me on the shoulder the way you do with someone you're trying to move along quickly. "We're about to do family photos, just, if you could hang back a few minutes, that'd be great," and then he was gone again, pulled back toward his mother, who was directing people the way a general directs troops. I stood there at the edge of that tent, the plaque heavy in my hands, and I watched the photographer, a young woman with 2 assistants, start calling out instructions. Okay, immediate family first, let's get Mom and Dad, David and Emily, right here by the fountain. And Diane moved into position beside Richard like she'd rehearsed it, radiant, commanding, and Emily and David fell in beside them. And I started to step forward, because I am the father of the bride, because whatever paperwork existed on that business, whatever guest list Diane had drawn up, I am Emily's father, and there has never been a photograph of my daughter's life that mattered more to me than the ones I wasn't in. Diane's eyes found me moving toward the group, and her voice, sweet as spoiled milk, cut across the lawn. Walter, honey, we're just doing David's parents in this first set. It's a whole thing with the composition, the photographer wants it balanced. Why don't you get yourself a drink and we'll grab you in the next round? And she said it loud enough that a dozen heads turned to look at me, loud enough that I felt every one of those looks land on my chest like small stones. I looked at Emily. I want you to understand what I mean when I say I looked at her the way a man looks at the one person who can fix everything with a single sentence. She looked back at me and I saw something cross her face, something like shame or maybe just exhaustion, the exhaustion of a woman who has spent 3 years being the seam that holds 2 families together by sheer force of her own effort. And then she looked away, down at her shoes, and she didn't say a word. I stepped back. I set the plaque down on the gift table between a bottle of wine and somebody else's card, and I found a spot near the drinks table, off to the side, and I got myself a club soda because my hands needed something to hold on to, and I watched for 25 minutes. While my daughter's in-laws directed round after round of photographs, the parents, the siblings, the grandchildren already on the way according to something I overheard, cousins, family friends who apparently qualified as family enough for the photographer's lens, and never once, not one single time, did anyone wave me forward. I want to tell you what that does to a man. It's not loud, it doesn't knock you down. It's quiet, and it's cold, and it settles into your chest like a stone you swallowed, and you stand there smiling, actually smiling, because you don't want to be the man who ruins his daughter's anniversary party, and the whole time that stone just gets heavier. While I was standing there, holding my club soda, trying to look like a man who was simply enjoying the party rather than a man being systematically erased from his own daughter's family portrait, I needed some air that didn't have jazz music and Diane's voice in it, so I walked around the side of the garage, where there was a little gravel path and a bench nobody was using. I sat down there, in the shade, just to breathe for a minute, and that's when I heard voices coming from just the other side of the garage wall, close enough that I could hear every word, and far enough that they had no idea I was there. It was Diane's voice first. I just think, she was saying, we need to be thoughtful about how visible he is going forward, especially now that Richard's partners are starting to come around more. People talk, and I don't need people asking why David's father-in-law looks like he just came off a construction site. Then David's voice, quieter, and I strained to hear it, and what I heard was my son-in-law saying, Mom, come on, he's not that bad, and I want you to notice, listening to me right now, that he didn't say, he's my wife's father, and I won't hear this, he said, he's not that bad, like I was a stain he was defending on a technicality. And then Emily's voice, and this is the part that has stayed with me longer than anything else that happened that day. Emily said, I know, it's just, every time Dad's around, it reminds everyone how far we've come, from where David and I started. And I just want today to be about us, about how far we've come, not about, and she didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. I finished it for her in my own head, sitting on that bench, and the word I filled in was not about you. I sat on that bench for a long time after their voices faded back toward the party. I looked down at my hands, at the same calluses Diane had appraised the very first time we met, hands that had spent 31 years keeping the roads of this county safe enough for people like Richard and Diane to drive their German cars over without a second thought, hands that had signed a check for a wedding venue and a business loan and a plaque with a dead woman's favorite poem carved into it, and I thought about how it had come to this, a man sitting alone behind a garage at his own daughter's anniversary party, listening to his family discuss him like an embarrassing relative they hadn't managed to fully cut loose yet. I want to tell you, I stood up right then and marched back into that party and gave them all a piece of my mind. I didn't. I sat there another 10 minutes, and then I stood up, and I brushed off my new sport coat and I walked back to the party and I smiled, and I made small talk with a woman from Diane's book club about the weather, and I stayed until the cake was cut, and I hugged my daughter goodbye, and I drove the 50 minutes home in silence. No radio, just the sound of my own tires on the highway, and that stone sitting heavy in my chest the whole way. I didn't sleep much that night. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table David had sat at asking for help 2 years before, and I thought about everything: the wedding, the down payment, the business loan, the 7%, and somewhere around 2 in the morning, sitting there in the dark with a cup of coffee gone cold in front of me, I made a decision. Not a decision born out of anger, though there was plenty of that. A decision born out of something closer to clarity. I decided I was done being quiet about my own worth. The following Monday, I called that same lawyer friend who'd helped me structure the loan 2 years earlier. I asked him to pull the paperwork, and we went through it together, line by line, at his office, and he confirmed what I already remembered but needed to hear again, plainly, from someone whose job it was to know these things. I held 7% equity in David's company, real, documented, transferable ownership, not a favor, not a gesture, an actual stake in a business that, according to the most recent numbers, David himself had shared proudly with Emily and me over dinner the year before, was now valued at just over $2 million. 7% of $2 million is a number that gets a man's attention no matter how many years he's spent doing math on a construction site. But the money, I want to be honest with you, was never really the point, not that morning sitting in my lawyer's office. The point was that I had spent 3 years letting this family decide what I was worth to them, and I had just found the one piece of paper that said, on the record, in the eyes of the law, that I was worth something whether they liked it or not. My lawyer asked me what I wanted to do, and I told him I wanted options. Not action yet. Options. He walked me through them. As a minority shareholder, I had rights, limited, but real, rights to information, rights that would matter enormously if the company were ever sold or restructured, rights that David, in his eagerness 3 years earlier, and his mother's confidence that I'd never actually used them, had signed away to me without a second thought. I didn't call Emily that week. I didn't call David. I let the anniversary party sit there, unaddressed, and I could tell from the silence on the other end, the absence of any call checking in on how I was doing, that everyone involved had decided the whole thing would simply be allowed to fade, the way uncomfortable things in families often are, if nobody brings them back up. 3 weeks after the party, I got a call from David, and his voice had that same nervous energy it had the night he sat at my kitchen table asking for help. "Walter," he said, "hey, so, we're looking at bringing on a new investor, a bigger firm. They want to buy out some of the smaller equity positions to simplify the cap table before they come in, and I wanted to talk to you about maybe cashing out your position. It'd be a nice little windfall for you." A nice little windfall. I sat with that phrase for a second before I answered him. I asked him what number they were thinking. He said something in the range of $140,000 for my 7%, which even I could do the math on fast enough to know was well under what the company's actual valuation would suggest, and I understood in that moment exactly what was happening. They weren't trying to reward me. They were trying to clean me off the books, quietly, cheaply, before some bigger, five, more sophisticated investor came in and started asking who this Walter Hendricks fellow was and why he was sitting on a piece of their company. I told David I'd think about it, the same thing I told him 2 years before, when he first asked for my help, and I could hear something shift in his voice, a little more urgency creeping in, and he said, "Walter, look, this needs to move pretty quickly. The investors want a clean structure by end of quarter," and I said, "David, I understand and I'll get back to you." That week, I did something I probably should have done 3 years earlier. I hired an actual business valuation consultant, a man named Frank who my lawyer recommended, someone who specialized in exactly these situations, minority shareholders getting squeezed out ahead of bigger deals. Frank spent 4 days going through what public information existed and what David's own investor materials, which as a shareholder I was legally entitled to request, actually showed. And what Frank came back with wasn't $140,000. It was closer to $310,000, more than double what David had offered, based on the real, current valuation the incoming investors were using in their own paperwork. I called David back on a Friday evening. I asked him, calm as I could manage, whether he was aware that the buyout offer he'd given me was less than half of what independent valuation supported. There was a long silence on the line, long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Then he said, "Walter, that's just the number the investors gave us to work with." And I told him, "David, I've seen the investor materials now. I know what they're actually paying for equity in this round. I know what my 7% is actually worth." He didn't have much to say to that. What he did have to say, when he finally found his voice, was, "Walter, please, this deal falls apart if we can't get the cap table cleaned up in time. We need this investment. The company needs this. Emily and I need this. Please. Just take the 140. It's still a lot of money." And I remember sitting in my kitchen, looking at that same table, thinking about a young man sitting right across from me 2 years earlier, hat in hand, and I thought about Diane's voice through that garage wall, about visibility and construction sites and people talking, and I thought about my daughter's voice finishing a sentence with the words, "How far we've come," instead of any word at all for me. I told David no. I told him I would be exercising my full rights as a shareholder, and that any buyout would happen at fair market value as determined by the valuation my own consultant had prepared, backed up by his own investors' numbers, or I would not be selling at all, and I would be a shareholder in that company for as long as I chose to be, showing up, as was my right, to review whatever paperwork I was entitled to review, for as long as it took. The week after that call, everything came apart at once, the way I suppose it always does once the first domino finally tips. Emily called me, crying, and I want to say that hearing my daughter cry is not something that has ever once in her whole life left me unmoved, and it didn't that day either, but I had made a decision the night after that anniversary party, sitting alone with cold coffee, and I was not going to unmake it just because it had finally made noise loud enough to reach her. "Dad," she said, "why are you doing this? This could ruin everything for David. Why can't you just let this go?" And I asked her, gently as I could, whether she remembered the anniversary party, whether she remembered the family photos, and there was a long silence on her end of the line, and then she said, quietly, "That's not the same thing." And I told her, "Emily, it is exactly the same thing. It is the exact same thing dressed up in a different set of clothes. You have all spent 3 years deciding how much room there is for me in this family, and every single time, the answer has been less than I deserved, and I am done letting other people set that number for me." She didn't have an answer for that. I heard her crying on the other end, and it broke something in me to hear it and not immediately give in, but I stayed quiet, and finally she said, "I have to go," and she hung up. Diane called 2 days later, and I want to tell you, of everyone in that entire family, Diane was the only one who never once pretended this was about anything other than what it was actually about. She didn't cry, she didn't ask why, but she told me, in that same sweet, syrupy voice she'd used on the front steps of her house, that people like me needed to understand our place in a family like theirs, that I had been given an extraordinary opportunity to be part of something bigger than myself, and that greed at my age was, in her words, unbecoming. I let her finish. Then I told her that a man who spent 31 years keeping her German car from falling into a pothole on his way to her charity luncheons did not need a lecture on unbecoming behavior from a woman who hid her son-in-law behind a garage wall to keep him out of her party photos. I told her that I had heard every word she said that day, every word, and that I had spent 3 weeks deciding what to do with what I heard, and this, my exercising the rights I was legally granted, was what I had decided. Then I hung up the phone, and for the first time in 3 weeks, I slept the whole night through. The deal, as it turned out, could not close without me. My lawyer confirmed that the incoming investors required a clean, unanimous cap table, and my refusal to sell at the lowball number meant the entire transaction stalled. David called me one more time, and this call was different from the others, quieter, more honest, no urgency, dressed up as friendliness. He asked me, point blank, what I actually wanted, and I told him the truth. I told him I wanted fair value for my shares, paid as Frank the consultant had calculated, and I told him I wanted an apology, not for him, not really, but I wanted to hear Emily and Diane both say, out loud, that what happened at that party was wrong, and I wanted it before a single dollar changed hands. I want to tell you that David gave me that apology on the spot, but he didn't. Nobody gave me anything for another 6 weeks. Instead, the investment deal that had felt so urgent to David 3 weeks earlier simply sat there, frozen, month after month, while I lived my life exactly as I had before, playing cards with a group of retired county workers on Wednesday nights, walking the trail by the reservoir most mornings, and refusing every single call from that side of the family except when Emily called alone, without David, without Diane on speakerphone. Those calls with Emily, just the two of us, started to change something. She stopped defending the party. She started, slowly, admitting things, that she'd felt sick to her stomach watching me stand at that drinks table, that she'd heard herself finish that sentence behind the garage and hated the words as they came out of her mouth, that she had spent 3 years so afraid of causing friction with Diane that she had let her own father become a stranger at family events he had personally paid for. It took 3 months, 3 full months of that business deal sitting stalled, of David's investors growing impatient, of Diane, I later learned, quietly furious at both her son and her daughter-in-law for letting this happen at all, before Emily finally did something that changed everything. She showed up at my house, alone, on a Sunday afternoon, the kind of gray November afternoon that makes a man think about how fast the years actually go, and she sat down at my kitchen table and she cried, real crying, not the crying of a woman asking her father to back down, but the crying of a daughter who finally understood what she had allowed to happen. She told me she was sorry. She told me that somewhere over those 3 years, she had let herself believe that keeping the peace with Diane was more important than protecting her own father's dignity, and that watching me stand at that drinks table for 25 minutes while family photos happened without me had been the moment she finally saw, clearly, what that choice had actually cost. She told me David had started seeing it too, slowly, that the frozen deal and his mother's fury and my continued absence from every family gathering had finally forced him to look at what kind of husband and son-in-law he had been. I didn't make it easy for her, and I don't apologize for that. I told her I loved her more than anything in this world, and that would never change, but that love and respect are not the same thing, and a man can give everything he has to his family and still be owed the basic decency of standing in a photograph with them. I told her the money mattered less to me every single day, but the principle of it, the principle would matter to me for the rest of my life, and I needed her to understand the difference. We talked for 3 hours that afternoon, longer than we'd talked in years, and by the end of it, something had shifted between us, not fixed, not entirely, but shifted, the way a bone that's been reset starts to heal, even though it's never quite the same as it was before the break. 2 weeks later, David called and asked to come see me, alone, no lawyers, no paperwork, just him. He sat at that same kitchen table, and this time there was no nervous circling of a coffee mug. He looked at me and told me he was ashamed that he had spent his whole life letting his mother make decisions for him because it was easier than standing up to her, and that watching his own wife nearly lose her father over his cowardice had finally been enough to break that habit. He apologized, plainly, without excuses, for the front door, for the photos, for the $140,000 offer he now understood for exactly what it was. And then he told me the investors had agreed to fair value for my shares, the full amount Frank had calculated, and that he wanted to pay it not because his lawyers told him he had to, but because I had earned it 3 times over and he was ashamed it had taken him this long to see it. I want to tell you what I did with that money, because I think it matters. I didn't buy a boat. I didn't take some grand vacation to make up for lost time. I put most of it away, the retirement cushion I'd sacrificed on that wedding, finally restored and then some, and I took a portion of it, a meaningful portion, and I opened a small trust for the grandchild Emily told me, that same Sunday afternoon at my kitchen table, she and David were expecting. Diane and I have never fully reconciled, and I've made my peace with that. She sent a card, eventually, a formal, careful thing that read more like a legal disclaimer than an apology, and I keep it in a drawer, not because it means much to me, but because it's a reminder of exactly where I stand with her, clear-eyed, no illusions. Richard, for his part, called me once, man to man, and told me he respected what I'd done more than he'd admit to his wife, and I believed him. Emily and David are still together, and from what I can see, stronger for having gone through this, not because a business deal forced their hand, though I suppose it did in a way, but because somewhere in the middle of all that stalling and silence and hard conversation, my daughter found her voice, and my son-in-law finally learned to use his. Last month, at the baby shower, I stood in the very front row for every single photograph, and nobody moved me to the side, and nobody asked me to come around back. And when the photographer called for immediate family, my daughter reached out, took my hand herself, in front of everyone, in front of Diane, and pulled me into the center of the frame. I think about that anniversary party sometimes, the 25 minutes I stood at that drinks table with a club soda in my hand, invisible in plain sight at a celebration I had helped make possible in more ways than one. I don't regret paying for that wedding, and I don't regret co-signing that loan, and I don't regret a single dollar I gave that family. But I learned something standing behind that garage wall, listening to the people I loved most in the world decide how much room there was for me in their lives, and it's this: you can give everything you have to the people you love, every dollar, every calloused hour of your labor, every sacrifice a man can make, and none of it will buy you a place in the photograph. Respect isn't something you can purchase in advance. It has to be claimed, sometimes quietly, sometimes with nothing more than a piece of paper you had the good sense to keep, and once you claim it, once you finally stand up and say, "I belong in this picture too," you'd be amazed how quickly the people who love you find a way to make room.